Here's a completed one. You can keep in mind that this can be adjusted. If you want this shorter, just cut it shorter or vice versa. If your wool's really thick and dense, it's going to change the sizing a little bit. So keep that in mind. Maybe go just a little bit bigger. And the last thing is, if you're sewing this on a machine, I would follow all the steps. However, the only step I would do different is sewing the complete ear pieces on. That way you can center this, and when you're sewing it on a machine, everything will go just a little bit smaller, so you're probably going to want to go a size up since these seams will be tight together. And with that said, this is all going to be a little smaller, and this piece will be the same size, so it will overlap these pieces just by like a stitch or two. So what you're going to want to do is mark the center of this, follow the video like you're hand sewing it, mark the center of this, clip it down, and that's going to go just over the top of these by just a little bit on each side, and you'll be good to go. So you can do the kit patterns or sew it on a machine, whip a whole bunch of these out real quick. A couple things before you get started. You're going to need a small piece of veg tan, 4 or 5 ounce, I find works best. These fabric marking pens, they're heat erasable. However, since this stuff goes back in the cold, if it's under freezing temps, these could reappear, but they're also washable. So if you have any issues with that, these also will wash out. Here's the pattern here. So these are the little straps that will go on that veg tan piece. You'll print your pattern off, cut right on this line. And I might go just inside a hair and outside a hair. Makes it a little easier for me to line up everything. So you can see the dots on both sides clearly. Since this is wool, it's not going to be how we do a lot of the other patterns I have, where you cut outside the line, tape it down. This one, we're going to put tape on both sides of this and make it a little more rigid, and we can just reuse this template over and over. But the process of tracing it on our hide is going to be a little different, so this is how I'll do that. We're going to cover the whole pattern with tape. You don't want to pull the tape too tight because it could pull the paper together. It's not necessary, but I like to cover the back side with tape also. Just makes it that much more rigid, and I can use this pattern many times. Once you get this all taped, you can cut it out with scissors, or you can cut it out with a utility knife. And the difference in this one is we're going to cut right on the line. To finish getting this ready now, we're going to punch all these holes before we place this on the leather. I like to use a 5/64 inch hole punch. That way when we place this down and trace all the stitch marks, it won't be too small or too big. And punch all these holes out. Now all the holes are punched. You're going to take your parts. If you want to tape them down just in the center to hold them still, you can cut out little sections. The only problem is it can pull and distort the leather, the look of this a little bit. So if you're going to take a piece of tape and put it across there, make sure you put it on some fabric or your hands or something. I'll press it on my leg. You don't want that to be too sticky. Just enough so it will kind of help hold that in place. So do some tests with these pens on a couple scraps, see how you like it, see what you need to do to get them to disappear enough. I usually go with the blue or maybe the red. These are Madame So, heat erasable. I think a lot of them are pretty much the same thing. Let's do blue this time. You need to make sure you hold this nice and still. You're not stretching this material around it all, that it's sitting nice and flat. You don't want to press too hard. If you press real hard, it's going to get into the leather too much. And sometimes these pens, you need to go on a piece of paper or something just to get them to flow a little bit. Before you pull this off, give it a look. Make sure all your lines and holes are good. You can see that tape didn't leave any marks. So the next step will be cutting your parts out. Now a lot of people will use a knife and just get through that first layer, but since this is more of a rustic look, these edges are going to show. I'm going to use a nice pair of scissors. The only thing you need to keep in mind while you're cutting this is to keep this under part of the scissor right up against that skin. You don't want to just haphazardly cut through. You're going to mess with the wool side. Try to get it as straight as you can right off the bat, but you can come back and trim it a little bit if you need to. And little clips are better than going with big long strokes with the scissors here. Again, I'm keeping that bottom part of the scissors pressed up against underneath, so I'm not cutting into too much of that wool. And I'll go across just so these fuzzies don't pop off everywhere as I'm doing other steps. Get rid of some of this loose stuff here. I'm going to do the same to all the sides of this. It can be helpful to trim some of this off. You're not going to want to trim all the way back to where the stitches are, because that could leave little bare spots in the cap. But I am going to trim back maybe like half that distance, just so sewing isn't so difficult. You can always trim more, but if you go too much, there's not a whole lot you can do. So take your time. A little bit at a time. And don't get too crazy and wrap around this curved edge, because that edge isn't going to get sewn. And if it's helpful, you can form that edge a little bit first. I'll show you how to do that in a second here. This can be used too for like where the stitching is going, to get in here. This actually works better for this step. Just be careful not to go too deep. That actually gets closer to the skin. Just make sure if you're rounding off these edges, the only edges you're rounding off and cleaning up are the ones that won't have any stitches on it. Again, you can always cut more, but if you go too much, you're stuck with what you got. And one of the reasons I do this step first before I sew it all together is just in case I mess it up. I'm not redoing a whole cap if it's that bad. Then you'll go back and kind of round it off a little bit. And I'd rather not cut it enough than too much. Inside this edge, it might be easier to grab something a little smaller. When you're punching these holes, I usually go with, this is my 0.8 millimeter hole punch, just a really small hole punch. Stitching chisels can work, but that's more of a cut, so I find that it could tear more. I think a hole punch is just a better way to go. It makes the holes just a little bit more durable from the threads pulling through and ripping anything. But you can butt this up against here and try to get the wool out of the way as much as possible. That can be pretty time consuming. I found that if you just hold this flat and get it situated so you're right on that hole and just punch right through. And just by doing this, you're saving a lot of time, and the fuzz that gets cut and whatnot, it really is pretty insignificant. I don't notice any difference in trying to keep it out of the way. That's so cumbersome, it's just a pain in the butt. So just hold it flat, get these punched out. So when you're doing these little straps, piece of veg tan, 4 or 5 ounce, I think this is a 5 ounce right here, but it's different. It's like my other patterns. We're not going to do the same thing we're doing on that wool. Cut out just outside of these lines, and we're going to tape this down. And if you're making a few of these, or to make it easier, you can just use a strap cutter. Cut strips of this. They're all the same. You just tape these down, punch holes, and that slot for the buckle. You're going to want to make sure you're punching these holes for the size of rivets you'll be using. First thing we're going to do with this one is sew the 2 pieces of boxing together. And it's usually helpful to throw some clips on there. Just make sure that wool's out of the way. There's a lot of different ways to sew this stuff together. I'll probably just do a loop stitch on this one. You can do a loop and then back like I do on mitten patterns. I'm going to tie a knot. I'll pull that knot down and oftentimes grab a needle and just pull that through to the underside. But since I got that knot swooped around to this side, I'll actually go back through this hole so that that knot is pulled against it, creating tension. That way, right away, this first loop will look real nice instead of coming from the knot on top. And I'll just go straight across, pull it tight. You don't want to wrench on it. Just make sure each one of those loops looks nice. Hold with the other hand or something so it goes across straight. And I tied a little knot, put a dab of glue on it. What I like to do is just go through to pull this excess down to the other side. Now let's get these other ends together here and make that loop. Same thing as before, just make sure you get that wool out of the way. Another thing I do when I'm tying this knot is instead of just going through once, I'll go through that loop twice. It just helps hold it for when you tighten this down, it's not going to loosen up. So when you come back and do that other standard once through, maybe do that twice, just helps it keep real tight. Just a little dab to work into the knot. If you're using like a wax thread or something else, it probably isn't as huge a deal, but this stuff can be real silky. So I want to make sure that's not going to let go. Now that we got to the other side here, we'll just tie a knot, but I like to go through that hole again just to go straight over. And once it's started, I'll pull again to tighten that up. and hold it. And then I'll go through twice just to really make sure that knot's not going to slide on me. And I'll pull it down towards the hole, and I'll do it again so that the knot's big enough so it won't slide through and loosen anything up. A little bit of glue can help. Really, however you want to do this knot's fine. There you go. Next will be to put the top on the boxing here. And I marked the hole in between two where that seam is going to be. So each side of that seam, each hole will be those two holes. And then I marked every 10 stitches. And this one, since it's round on the inside, it's going to seem like it wants to bunch up on the inside. So these marks are real important so that everything will line up nicely as you're sewing here. You can kind of see the holes lined up too as you're clipping in between the two. This one, it's a little easier to clip all the way around if you want before you start sewing. There's a lot of different ways you can tie these knots on here. You can even just make a knot so it doesn't go through the hole. Like always, I'll probably put a little dab of glue on there. I'd rather it be too much than not enough. And what I'll do is kind of give it a tug to get that to twist so the knot's right up against that hole there, so it doesn't loosen up at all later on. If this is loosening up on you, you can always throw a clip back on the threads you already went through there. When you get to this seam, these holes that got stitched together are actually considered two separate holes. So I'll go up this side on the seam. And then when I come down, I'll actually go through the other side of that seam. And then just continue on. All right. All right, next let's sew the two ear flaps together just on this back seam, and then we'll sew this around the cap. If you're going to be putting the straps that are included in the pattern on here, I like to trim some of that wool from behind, because this will be a reinforcement behind either where the buckle will be or that little strap. It just really reinforces it. We'll put a little glue in there as well. But feel for that hole and then just start kind of trimming around a little bit so that you can fold right on that hole and see it. And then you're going to trim like you would for stitches. Don't hit that leather, the skin part. And you're going to want to make it smaller than this. You don't want it the size of that. Just enough so you can see it a little bit better. And you're not struggling. And I'll put a little glue on here. And test it first, maybe, before you jump into the glue. Make sure it'll lay pretty flat. You can always trim a little more of the fur. I might want to actually. I'll do a little dab on both. And then just kind of spread it around. I'll either put a weight on there or a couple clips. Let that dry. You could always do both sides and then let it dry. I'd rather have not quite enough glue than too much. You don't want it oozing out the sides, getting on the fur. That's on. Put a little glue on that side. And down this. And if you can find rivets where the back also is smooth, I think it looks a little better. But if you have to do one side that's smooth, do the side that's going to show. Now hold that a lot better than not having something on the back. And that almost gets covered up. If you need to skive, I skived this a little bit on each side just so it wasn't quite so thick. If you have longer rivets, it's not a huge deal. But a little glue in between here maybe too. You can just do more of those two pieces. If you do one on each side, then you could just tie something around it. I mean, there's so many different ways to do that part, but I like the little buckle. That's that. If you're using veg tan, it'll be stiff for a little bit, but it'll soften right up with use. I like little buckles that have a strap keeper on them. I'd also suggest some buckles will have like a curvature to them. You don't want them to be concaved. With the ear flaps done, we can put those on the top part here. I have some marks on this side to start with the corresponding marks on this. We'll start right on the seam. And same as before, tie a knot, slide it around so it butts up against the hole. Keep working your way all the way around to the end of this ear flap. And we'll put that forehead piece on. When you get to the end here, I will show you how you could just put this on here and continue on. It'll be the same way, but I usually always mark the center and start clipping from that center just to make sure everything's going to line up. And I'll even count out some stitches here from that center mark. And just go 10 each way. And that center mark will go right in the middle of that seam there. Then each hole on each side of that mark is each hole on each side of that seam. It can be helpful too to look at the holes to make sure they're directly across from each other. So at this point, there's going to be one hole in between these two parts that's only on the top, and we're going to go through just that hole on the top. But first, when I get to the end of parts, I like to go through twice, just so that second time will go directly over the top, just kind of help hold the edge of this part down. And I'll do the same thing once I cross to the other side here. And then this is that hole that's only on the top, so we're going to go through that and right in between these two parts, just for that one hole. And then we're going to hop in to the first hole on this forehead piece. And again, I like to go through that first hole twice. Same as the other side, I went through twice on the last hole. Then just the one hole on the top. Only going through that. And then starting on the next part. And again, I'll go through that hole twice as well. Now it's just a matter of getting to that back seam and tying a knot. The last thing to do will be to fasten this up. And there's a lot of ways to do it. You could put a rivet right through there, or even just a little bit of glue. But what I like to do is make sure it's where I want it. And this can be adjustable if you want it lower, if you want this piece longer. When I get it situated, I'll pinch right where I want that stitch and grab one of these pens. And I'll say, try to keep all standard pens away while you're doing this project, because it's easy to just grab a pen and mark something. It'll be hidden behind here, but it's better just to leave those pens off to the side so you don't accidentally mark something. And I'll usually just come in and down a hair, because we're just going to stitch around these couple holes here. And since these are hidden, they can be moved around a little bit if they're off. Not a huge deal. Just poke a couple holes. When you come in, don't go all the way down and back up. You're going to grab a bunch of wool. Just come in and ride right along the skin and pop right back out. And then right through the corresponding side. like I usually do, go through twice, because then that knot's going to hold tight. You're not going to struggle to try to keep it tight while you're going through the second time. I'll put a little dab of glue on those knots. Once I know this is right, put it on my head, look in the mirror, or put it on a mannequin or something. But I'll also look at this fold, make sure it looks the same on both sides. This side might be a hair tighter, but the distance across this seam here is matching up. Yeah, it looks good. That'll be good right there. A little glue on those knots and this one's done. Wear this down, obviously fold this up and attach it on the top. There's also, if you leave that back down, these can fold around the back and attach back here so that it stays around your ears a little bit. So now all you need to do is hit it with a hot hair dryer. I usually like to throw these in my dryer itself just to get rid of marks instead of sitting there with this dryer the whole time. But you'll see that this stuff will disappear with heat. Works pretty good. But I'll throw this in the dryer, be quick about it.